Let's get started. It is that time. Most of you know me. Hi, hello, I'm Jeanette Bruce. I'm the program coordinator here at the library. Delighted to have you here in person this evening for our chat with Emily Hannah. I will officially kick off our event by expressing my gratitude that we are able to gather this evening on the shared unceded territories of the Squamish Nation and the Little Nation. And it's pretty cool that we're talking about working that land. We're talking about caring for the land. So that's pretty wonderful. Most of you, if not all of you, have been to an event in this room before, but if you haven't, the library is now closed, so we'll just ask that you not go out through these sliding doors, but you can access the washroom through the door at the back. There's also a sink back there if you need to fill up a water bottle or anything like that. Please put your phones on a quiet setting. Thank you. Yes, you may take them out now. You can take quiet setting just for the next hour and a bit. You're welcome to take notes on your phone. You don't have to put them away. That's allowed. Also, if you're wondering about Emily's slides, as you just heard, we are recording this presentation tonight, and I will send it out to everybody here. Please send it to your friends because we record the YouTube stats as well. That counts as program attendance for us, and we love that. So you'll have the slides, so don't feel like you have to frantically scribble every little bit down. That's about it from me. Oh, we are going to do skill testing questions from Emily. We have a beautiful Worcester Public Library 1. Worcester Public Library 2. To give away, so listen carefully because the answers to the questions will be in Emily's talk. We'll do that at the end, and we will have lots of time for questions. And if there's a question you have that Emily can't answer, I've confirmed that her two wonderful coworkers who we've hosted before, Claire, who's an expert on landscape gardening, and Harriet, who is a food grower, we can pass questions along to them, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to answer them. Okay, take it away, Emily.
Thank you. Yeah, good evening, ladies. I'm happy to be here. I just moved to Whistler about 7-8 months ago in April, so it's been a bit of a transition, acclimatizing to this growing season that's very short. But I'm really enjoying it so far, and I'm happy to be here and meet people in the area and just talk about what I know. So yes, this evening I want to talk about fall gardening and what we can do during the fall season to improve our soil, because this is kind of my area of expertise. Yeah, so there's some slides. There's not a ton of information on the slides, some pictures, just some points of reference. And I have some props here, books that I recommend. Feel free to take a look. We talk about them after as well. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or we'll have a question and answer opportunity at the end. So just a little bit of background about who I am. So I work at the Brew Creek Centre. So Claire and Harriet, who have done some work presentations here before, they work there as well. It's just 15 minutes down the road. I don't know if any of you guys have been there before. It's a pretty magical place. I feel very, very lucky to be there. So I've been working there since April, and we're in a really interesting transition phase where we've historically done a lot of events and weddings, but transitioning more into being an agricultural education center. So definitely keep your eyes and ears out for different workshops and programs that we're running there, because we want to do more of this kind of work there. So far, we've had school groups come up on field trips. So we take them for a tour around, we talk about them, we get their hands in the dirt, we get them to help them with some of our tasks and run classes for them. Other than that, I'm like to refer to myself as a permaculturalist instead of a farmer, sometimes agriculturalist, but permaculture is kind of my background. Do any of you guys know, have you heard of this term permaculture before? So it comes from permanent agriculture, but for me at this point, it's kind of just a way of being in the world. It's kind of a philosophy. It's many, many things. So I find this this quote by Jeff Lawton, quite helpful. So permaculture, permanent agriculture, is the conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems, which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. So it's the harmonious integration of landscapes and people, providing their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. So this is kind of the way that I like to live my life, with just this harmonious relationship with nature. So a lot of the agricultural work that I do, the gardening that I do, is all about giving back to the lands that feed us. And then more recently, I am a soil food web student. So this is kind of like my focus right now, is studying soil science. So I like to take kind of the biology using microscopes, and then how does that actually equate to practical things that we can do within our gardens. So I like to do the really deep dive into like looking at the microbiology within the soil and what's going on. But it's nice to have those actually practical skills as well. So balancing the two. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I'm interested what you guys are looking for by coming to this talk. Just so that I can maybe tailor it in a way that's more helpful for you, if we wouldn't mind going around the room and just saying like, hi, my name is, and I'm here because, you know, I have a small garden in my backyard and I want to improve it, or I wasn't able to grow this veggie this year and I'd like to be able to next year. Can you guys do that for me? Yeah? We start on this side.
Hi, I'm Ginny. I've been this sort of thing before, so I just came in, have a new raised bed that's about 20 feet long. So right in.
Thank you.
My name's Janie, and I'm going to be part of a co-housing community over in Seashell. So in a couple of years, we're going to have a lot of land that will have had nothing done to it forever. So starting from scratch, I want to start this way.
Thank you.
Chris, and I've been gardening here for a long time, and I've been hearing all kinds of different things all the time about what's happening with putting your garden away for the winter.
Okay.
And I want to know what
Yeah.
I have a massive flower garden. I have no problem with flowers, but vegetables, and I just don't get along. And I want to get deep into the soil too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Don't get along yet. But.
My name is Penny. I'm relatively close by to the Brew Creek Centre, so similar growing area. And I have a very, quite a big garden. Both, I'd say there's some permaculture in there and some food garden mixed in with my landscaping, but then I also have a lot of vegetable growing areas. And I guess I'm looking for, I'm really interested to know about soil, and I'm interested to know about, growing more and more for longer periods of time in the year all the time.
Thank you.
I'm Gail. I live close to too. And I just want to pick up any things I can get in soil.
I'm Maggie, and I challenged myself with COVID to grow all the veggies that I can, that I don't have to buy any veggies between June and September. And I'm almost there.
Wow. Congratulations.
Julia, Leda, just want to learn really. I've done skateboard wrapping into a raised garden. It's gone, so why now? I want to do the same as you actually. My name is Meredith, at Happy Light Flower Farm in Pemberton. So we have about almost 2 acres in production, and this year super proud that we did no spraying. So we got through the season, but yeah, I'm just trying to figure out some hacks to getting more organic matter and soil health back into the ground quickly.
Mm-hmm.
The quick season turnaround.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Edna, and I live in a strata property, and I help take care of the plants
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm Kate. I created a creative garden on our second floor deck. I've been really successful at growing spicy weeds, and the rest is not so much. I think I've got some virus problems, but the beans always go first. My peas, there's lots of aphids, but my first year growing was like heat growing last year, and then like no summer until August this year.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm Karen. I have a raised bed, and both my daughter is Flemish and myself and Lister grew carrots, and our carrots kind of well early and convoluted. There's some theories I'd like to sort of find out.
Mhm.
I'm Sandy. I have a big perennial garden, but just some small raised beds for veggies. And I would say the same. It's a lot more challenging than perennials and annuals to do it, organically. So I'm interested in building the soil back up. Particularly can't compost, nutrients to add to get that.
So is that in the Whistler municipality, you can't compost at all? By law? Bears.
I compost your weed. I have no bears. You're allowed. But we are allowed to. We are allowed to compost, but not kitchen scraps.
Oh, yeah.
Garden, all my gardening.
Mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
But not.
Yeah. I can maybe talk about this a little bit more in the presentation, but have you guys heard of worm composting? Because that's something you can do inside your house if you have a mud room or something like that for your kitchen scraps. That's about like one of the best things you can do for your veggie garden. Sorry.
I'm Rebecca. I've got a veggie garden at the small garden. It's very small, but I'm into anything to gardening, landscaping, veggies. If you're holding workshops, I'll be there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
My name is Carol. I've been gardening at Checkmoo's Community Garden since I think almost 10 years now. And any information that is always helpful. And we joke that it's a good thing we don't have to live off our lawns. We have a lot of failures, but not always, but anyway.
Yeah.
Sure. Emptying the soil properly would really be helpful.
Yeah. What I
All
love.
kinds of conflicting information.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like how far to move down, because some people don't want you disturbing all the
Mhm,
down
mhm.
there.
Yeah. What I love about finding this work is that I will never be bored again. I know that there's always more digging to do, like, in all facets.
I'm Kara, and I'm from Germany. I'm just here for like 1 year in Canada, and I'm here now for a month. And I joined the community because it sounds very interesting. And I like the possibility to join anywhere and just experience whatever is
Mhm.
possible.
Yeah.
And I also have a garden at home, but I live off the garden. When I went to my relative's place on Vancouver Island, we collected a lot of grapes because the dog went there and ate them, but he wasn't allowed to, and so that was like the little thing of gardening I did not all.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys all for coming and sharing a little bit about yourself. It helps me kind of guide where the presentation goes, just knowing a little bit of what you guys are working with. Yes, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the soil food web. So this is kind of my area that I'm deep diving into right now. So it's a relatively new concept because historically when soil scientists were studying the soil, they were looking at the chemical components of the soil. So looking at it for its chemical structure, what is it made out of, sand, silts, and clays? Is there calcium present in it, phosphorus, all of these things? And there was a woman named Elaine Ingham, and she started a school called the Soil Food Web. And in the 60s, she started looking at soil under a microscope in its natural form and starting to see all of these interactions within the soil on a microscopic level. So this is what I study and use microscopes to look under the soil. And so it's all about what are the interactions going on within the soil. And in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, there's billions, if not trillions, of bacteria, protozoa, fungi, all these microorganisms living within there. And their interactions are what is feeding your soil. So we can pass this little infographic out to look a little deeper into it. But one of the most fascinating things that I learned through this school, through studying the soil food web, is that the sun, you know, as it hits the plants and the plants are photosynthesizing, they are creating sugars. The plant is creating sugars through the sunlight. And that sunlight is building the plant structure, the cell walls, the chlorophyll, but it's also sending these sugars in the form of carbohydrates into the root zone and sending it down there to colonize these little microorganisms. So the bacteria, the fungus, the nematodes, it's colonizing these microorganisms at the root zone and saying, hey, I'll trade you my sugars in the form of carbohydrates if you will go and get me calcium, if you will go and get me phosphorus. So there's this interaction, this play between all of these different beings in the soil. So the plants, they're kind of in control, and they're communicating with the soil life. So it's really, really important to keep that life happy and to create the right environment for those organisms to thrive. And that's what's going to supply your plants. If you're seeing deficiencies in your crops, if they're yellowing, if they're, you know, calcium deficient, if there's not enough nitrogen, I'm focusing on how can we get more organic matter into the soil so that these organisms can break those down into a form that's going to be available for the plant to take up. So in a lot of traditional industrial agriculture, they're adding these chemical fertilizers into their soil to be made available for the plants at that time of application. Whereas if you have a healthy soil food web, they're doing this 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. So you don't need to know what your plant needs, right? You don't need to be applying these fertilizers because they're going to do the work for you. So my focus is, okay, how do we make these organisms happy? Because if we do, then we're going to have healthy plants. Another thing that I'm really, really interested in right now is how that equates to our own health. So a lot of the deficiencies that we see in plants, we're also seeing in our own bodies. And so it's really, really important because these minerals, these nutrients, the calcium, the phosphorus, the boron, nitrogen, these are all things that our bodies need to thrive. And if they're lacking in our soil and our plants can't get them, they're going to be lacking in our bodies because this is how we're taking them up. So I'm really interested in the relationship between these nutrients in the soil that live within the particles of the soil. So soil is made up of usually sand, silt, and clay, organic matter. So those are really, really small particles of rocks in different forms. So that is the parent material is what they call it. And these organisms can go into these particles and mine these minerals. And this is what our body needs. So if it's there if we can access it in the soil, it can be uptaken by the plant and then be eaten and in our bodies. So I really like this diagram. It's a lot of information, but if you just focus on one mineral, you can kind of see how it's reflected in the plant and then what importance and significance it has in our body. Yeah, so on a practical level, how are we going to do this? So the easiest way to do this is to get organic matter into your soil. And there's a couple different ways to do that. So organic matter is just decomposing organic materials. So what I focus mostly on is compost, mulch, and plant debris and plant roots. So these are kind of my go-to ways of getting organic matter back in the soil. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the different methods that I use. So putting the garden to bed in the winter, we're going to a lot of times cut back a lot of our vegetation. I'm still on the fence about this because I know that one of the healthiest things that you can do for your soil is to have healthy plants in it. So my number one rule is never ever leave the soil bare. That's like the number one rule in organic gardening and regenerative and soil health is to never leave bare soil. So taking vegetation out, it's good because it cleans it up. We're heavily focused on the aesthetics of our garden, and it's been quite challenging for me going into more permaculture and regenerative agriculture because I come from a landscaping background where we're hyper focused on everything has to be clean and tidy and put away and in its place, where nature doesn't really do that. And so a lot of permaculture is mimicking nature with the intention of growing food that's going to feed us. So, you know, when the trees fall onto the soil, we come and we clear them away. But those leaves falling onto the soil are what builds humus. It's what builds the soil. And it's all this organic matter decaying over years that makes really, really healthy, vibrant soil. So I'm on the fence about removing plant debris. I'm trying to figure it out because if your plant is diseased, you definitely want to remove it from the soil because then the disease, the molds will be left in the soil and you'll have that problem recurring. It makes it easier in the springtime sometimes to plant, but as a recommendation for right now, I would say you're going to cut back your vegetation. Ideally, you're going to compost it. And as you said, you can have yard waste compost here. So I would definitely look into doing some of that. Static composting is a great one. So you just get a bin system and you put your yard waste in there. You maybe mix in some wood chips or some leaves and mix them together and leave them for a year. And in the next year, you'll be able to apply it into your garden. So setting up a compost system, and then you're going to be pruning. This is also a great time to transplant. So if you're wanting to rearrange your garden, or if something's not doing very well in one area, or you want to make some room, fall is a great time to transplant anything in your garden. So when you're transplanting, you want to dig around the root zone, give it lots of room so that you're not disturbing the roots too much. Put it in its new place and maybe add some compost to the base and then put it in the soil and maybe cut it down so it starts to feed its roots instead of focusing on sending energy up into the plant. So that's one tip for fall gardening. You can also do it in the spring. I like to do it in the fall. So as I mentioned, covering the soil, this is like my number one rule that I want to drive home. So in the springtime, if we're not going to plant an area, say if we're planting, in my example, if we're planting a field of squash, the squash isn't going to go in until later in the season because it's a heat-loving crop. We'll probably plant it out in end of June, July, but it has this April, May, and June where it's staying bare. So you never want to leave that bare. So you always want to have something covering the soil. And this is for many reasons. So one of the biggest reasons is erosion. So you can see in this photo, there was no crop covering the soil versus radishes planted in the fall. So radishes planted in the fall, they get covered, they protect the soil from the rain, and they will decompose and die off through the winter. So you don't have too much cleanup come spring, but look at the trench that leaving the soil unencumbered created. So all that topsoil is washing away. So you really want to protect it, especially with the heavy rains that we get here on the West Coast. We don't want to leave the soil bare, exposed to these waterways. And you think of the landslides that happened last year in the lower mainland. That's because of all the logging that we're doing in the area. And as soon as we take the root systems out of the earth, that soil, that humus, the ground, it doesn't hold. So it's the roots that are holding all the soil in place. So as soon as you take that out, you're exposing it to those natural disasters on a large scale, but in your garden, you're making it more vulnerable. So another reason to cover your soil always is to stop compaction. So when the heavy rains come, if that rain is dropping on uncovered soil, it's going to push that soil down, and you're going to lose a lot of air and structure from your soil. So we want to cover it so that either with plants or mulch, you want to cover it so that when the raindrops hit, they're dispersing, right? And they're not having that really intense effect. Yeah, I heard someone say recently that leaving your soil exposed to rain is worse than driving over your garden with, a dump truck. So you would never drive over your garden. You would never do that to your soil. It's rain penetrating. That compaction is, it's killing the environment for these microbes is what it's doing. It's making it an inhabitable place for them to live. And then also covering the soil creates a microclimate. So if you have soil covered, usually the mulches that you use will be dark in color. And when the springtime comes, that dark color will help to heat up the soil quicker. So if you have dark compost or wood chips or bark mulch laying on your soil, when the spring sun comes, it will heat up faster and you'll be able to plant in your soil sooner. It will also help protect if you have perennial plants that you want to protect through the winter frost. Mulch is a great way to blanket it, kind of create a little microclimate where it can stay warm and protected, protect it from the wind, protect it from the snow, the rain. Mulch also helps with water retention and drainage. So a lot of mulches will soak up a lot of the water, and it will help water move through so you don't get these stagnant spots that dry out really quickly or that pool with heavy rains. Yeah, and you can notice if you cover your soil with mulch, it's not going to dry out as quickly in the summer. So having that layer of mulch on the surface, the mulch might dry out, but it means your soil is protected underneath. And you don't want to dry out your soil because like us, these microorganisms, they need water to live. They will become dehydrated if they don't have moisture around them. That's how they move through the soil. That's how they, just like us, we need to drink. And the last thing I want to say about mulch is that it is a great weed suppression. So if you're having trouble with weeds, putting a layer of mulch in the fall or the spring is going to suffocate your weeds out. So that'll stop the light from getting to them, which will mean they won't be able to germinate and they won't be able to take over. So as long as you're mulching and then putting the plants that you do want on top of the mulch, then you'll be suppressing all the weeds around them. So I'm going to go over a couple of the different mulch options that I recommend and that I use. There's more, and it depends what you're growing. So I specifically focus on veggies and annual veggies for the most part. Whereas if I was doing a more perennial garden, say, I would focus more on wood chips because perennials really like more acidic soil. They have more symbiotic relationships with fungus, whereas annual plants have very symbiotic relationships with bacteria. So wood chips are a fungal feeding food, whereas these are more bacterial feeding foods. Yeah. Pine needles, they can be quite acidic, especially if they're fresh. So they're good for more perennial plants. I wouldn't be putting pine needles on my raised veggie beds because the vegetables won't like the acid that it adds, but spreading them around if you had fruit trees, if you had grapes, if you have any perennials, then they will do fine. They're a little bit hardier and can take that acid environment. They actually prefer it. But I'm always one to say, use what you have available. So one of the rules of permaculture is that you always go to your immediate environment first to find all of the resources that you need. And there's resources all around us. We just need to know what works. So a couple of the mulches that I use, compost is the number one. I know it can be difficult to make or get, and it's expensive, but this is what I focus a lot of my energy on. I spent all last year learning how to build the best compost. And so working with a couple different methods. I work with thermophilic composting, which is a hot composting. So it heats the organic matter up to a really high temperature that will kill any pathogens, weed seeds. It will decompose all that organic matter down into a fine tilth. And then as soon as it cools down, you can add it to your garden. So it's like a 3-month process from start to finish, which is great because a lot of other composting takes a long time. There's vermicomposting, which is something I really recommend for the home gardener because it's a great way to deal with veggie scraps. So if you guys want any resources on worm composting, I could do a whole 2-hour talk on worm composting. So I'll just touch on it, that it's a really good option for the home gardener because basically all the kitchen scraps that you get every week, they need to be fed once a week. So you acquire kitchen scraps over the week and then you feed it to your worms once a week and they just deal with it. And then, every couple of weeks you harvest from them and you have a constant supply. So you have to get used to being up close and personal with worms, but it's a quick hump to get over. Once you're over it, it's smooth sailing. And then another option for your yard waste, like I said earlier, is static composting. So that's composting that's not going to kill weed seeds, but it's going to kind of be a let it and forget it type of thing. So you're going to make a big mound at the end of the season in the fall with all your yard waste. You're going to mix it with wood chips, leaves, straw, whatever you want. Leave it in a mound, leave it for a year, and come back to it next year. So I could send out some resources if you guys want to look deeper into those different methods, but buying compost is quite expensive, but I would say it's the best thing that you can do for your garden. It gets tricky when the sellers of compost don't tell you what's in the compost. So I've heard a lot of people buy seed soil compost and then it ends up doing more harm to their garden than good. So you have to be a little bit selective about the compost that you get. If you do buy compost, fresh compost, and it comes really hot, don't apply it to your garden. Let it sit, maybe water it, let it sit, come down to an ambient temperature. So ambient meaning the same temperature as your skin. So when you grab it, it doesn't feel warm to you. Then you're safe to apply it. If you're applying it in the fall, it's not a big deal because there's not many plants in the ground that are going to be harmed. But if you get it in the springtime, or if you're applying it to your perennial beds, you want to let it cool down before you apply it because you'll burn your plants. A mulch that I use a lot on my farm is straw, and that's because it's really lightweight. When I'm doing, 2 acres of mulching, all that in wheelbarrows of compost is really, really hard work. So I like to use straw because it's light and it's easy to use. It's easy to acquire. It's a lot cheaper than compost. So we get our straw from Pemberton. So that's just the chaff. So when farmers harvest their grains, they take the seed head and they use that for milling, and then there'll be the chaff left that's all dried out and packed up together in a nice bundle. Costs about $7 a bale. You guys could probably get one bale for your backyard, and that would be enough to spread. Even, split a bale with your neighbor. So it's lightweight, it's affordable, it's easy to access here because lots of farmers in Pemberton have it, and it's really high in nitrogen. So it's going to be a really good source for your veggie gardens because it's gonna break down throughout the winter once you apply it, and then come spring your soil is going to be protected. It's going to be have this insulation, and then the straw is going to break down and add nitrogen to your soil.
You might get a spectacular crop.
Absolutely. I've been there, yeah. Inspecting your straw for seed heads, because sometimes you'll get the grain left in there that will then germinate. Yeah, I had a bed of garlic that was growing wheat. So we got 2 crops in one. Yeah. But that is something to consider. And usually you'll be able to see the weeds coming. Or if you take the straw off and apply compost in the spring, it can smother it.
What do you do with your leftover straw in the spring?
So we'll pull it back, we'll plant our new crop, and then we'll use the straw to kind of mulch around. Or we'll pull it back and leave it in the pathways, and then it can be a nice line the pathways. So you can do a couple things, or you can remove it and compost it, whatever look you like best. But yeah, if you're worried about if your straw comes with a lot of weeds or a lot of grain seeds, you want to be more diligent about moving it in the springtime. You don't want it to germinate there. But yes, yeah.
Is it better than using leaves?
Leaves are my favorite thing to use. Leaves are hard to come by where we're growing because it's all conifer forest. But I do drive around and pick up bags of leaves from people raking them in their yard. Yeah, so leaves are the next. Yeah, go ahead.
How do I know what's a good bag of compost? Because all of us don't buy compost.
Yeah, so
how do I know if I'm getting good organic?
Yeah, it's hard. Usually, okay, so rules of thumb, like I look at it under the microscope before I buy soil. I'll go and see their operation, see what they're doing, look at it under a microscope, see what's there. But for the home gardener, you want to smell it. If it smells off like rancid food or foul, that means it's not good compost. If it's warm, it means it's not good compost. It means it's not done decomposing. It means it's still fresh. And so it's hard to come by good compost. Worm castings, if you find worm castings at your nursery, those are a really safe bet because worms basically are taking the decomposing food and they're processing it through their intestines. And they have a certain microbiome biology in their intestines that are doubling, tripling the biology of what's already present. So for annual food growing, worm castings have great biology, and a little goes a long way. So you could just buy 1-2 bags and spread it through your whole garden, and that would be enough.
So would you dig it in or just leave it on the top?
I would either leave it on the top and mulch on top, or dig it in, because you don't want it to dry out. Another great way that I've been working with Sea to Sky Soils is that I make really good compost in small batches, because making compost is a lot of work. And I have worm castings, and I'll take Sea to Sky soil, which is cheap and not very decomposed in the right way, and I'll inoculate it. So if the sea to sky soil, although it doesn't have very good biology, it has a lot of organic matter that's been broken down. So you want to take compost that you know has good biology. So if you have a bigger garden, you would want to take worm castings and inoculate it into the sea to sky soil compost and let the worm castings feed on that organic matter. So you would take a bag of worm castings, mix it with the sea to sky soils, let it sit and kind of do its thing, and then you spread that on your garden. Because then it has the organic matter and it has the biology, and you've given the biology, the soil food web, the organisms, lots of food to feed off of. So they'll proliferate then.
And do you tarp it when you do that to stop the nitrogen from washing out? Or?
Yeah, so if you're experiencing heavy rains, I would tarp it. And if you're experiencing a lot of sun, I would cover it. But you don't want to tarp it for too long because you'll remove the oxygen. So I really like wire cages. If you're on a larger scale, I don't know if the home garden is going to have wire cages, but I like wire cages because they're cheap, they're easy to set up, and then you get airflow, which is really nice because those organisms need air to live. So I tarp the tops if it's raining or if it's really hot, and I try and keep them in the shade.
For how long do you need to mix the warm castings with the
So
sea to sky?
So you want to make sure your sea to sky compost is moist. When you're going to do this inoculation, you want to make sure your sea to sky soil compost is moist because organisms need that moisture to live. And also sea to sky compost comes really hot and really dry. And so you want to wet it and let it continue doing its decomposition process. And so if you add the worm castings right away, the heat might kill them off. So you want to make sure it's not too hot when you add your worm castings, and you want to mix it with moisture and let it sit for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks to 6 months, because 2 weeks will let them kind of start to proliferate, but if you leave them in there for too long, they'll run out of food. So 6 months is kind of the cutoff.
So it's good to do it in the fall.
Yeah, you could do it in the fall and then apply, but you could even get sea to sky soil delivered come September, add your worm castings, let it sit, and then as you're doing your, putting your beds to bed, then you spread it all on.
How long do the worm castings sort of survive before they are dormant or whatever?
So they will survive as long as they get food, water, and they don't like sun. So what's in the worm castings is mostly bacteria. So
if it's been frozen, they're all dead.
no, they will use, so usually you would apply compost and then maybe a mulch, and that interaction between the, when you get a heavy snow, that interaction on the surface beneath the snow is actually really well insulated, and they will keep proliferating in that environment. So if you put castings down and then either cover it with more compost or you put a mulch on, they will actually survive all through the winter. They might go, they slow down. They will, maybe won't be as fast, but if they have nice insulation from the snow, because the snow will actually insulate them under there, they will keep busy. But they will die or go dormant if they get too hot, if they dry out, or so you never want to leave your worm castings in an unmoist environment. They like it really moist, and they'll die if they get too hot, if they run out of water, and yeah, they slow down in the wintertime, but as long as they have a little insulation, they will keep working. So leaves are another great one, especially if you have deciduous trees in your backyard. Another great one, another great place to use the wire cages. So sometimes if you just put leaves on your garden, they won't break down in time or they'll just blow away. So a great thing to do is if you have a lawn, or a lawnmower is to collect all your leaves and run over it with a lawnmower. So you break it down into small little particles, and then you apply that onto your lawn, and it will stay in place. It will form a bit of a mat, and it will break down much quicker. And as it breaks down, it's going to release nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil. Another way to do that is if you're a little bit ahead of the game, and a lot of gardening is kind of planning ahead. So if this fall, if you collected a bunch of leaves and you put them in wire cages or put them in a pile and let them break down for the year. So let's say this year you decide to go with heavy composting. So that's the mulch you use, but you also have a bunch of leaves in your yard. If you gather them up and put them in a pile and let them sit for the whole year, come the next fall, you're going to have an amazing mulch to use because they'll already be broken down. And worms love leaves. This is like their favorite thing to eat. So you'll get a lot of this worm activity in your soil, which is amazing. One thing is, don't use leaves that are showing signs of disease, because then you'll just end up spreading disease all through your garden. And avoid any waxy leaves, so your cottonwoods. Those have lots of oils in them.
Yeah, what about alders?
Alders are good, yeah. Maples are great. Yeah.
So what do you do with cottonwood?
I would say put them in a pile and let them break down and use them the following year.
We used to put them in garbage cans and then take a weed eater
Yeah,
and go in and mulch them that way.
yeah,
And then shredding them to tiny pieces.
yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Yeah, it's the same as like the lawnmower, but if you don't have a lawnmower, yeah, that's a great way to do it. And green manures. This is another one that I use a lot. And it's more on a larger scale, but the philosophy behind the green manure is that the best way to improve your soil is to have healthy plants in the ground. So yes, you can put mulch and compost and leaves down, but the best thing you can do is have a plant growing there. Because of what I said earlier about the plants photosynthesizing and feeding the organisms. But another great green manure is grass clippings. So that's going to add a really strong boost of nitrogen to your soil. So it's not great if you have perennial gardens, but if you want to feed more annual beds, grass clippings are amazing. You want to soak them first, so when they're applied, they're quite wet, and maybe mix them into the soil a little bit. Cover cropping is something that I do because especially when areas where you have a longer growing season, if you don't have a crop in the ground, you want to get the soil covered, and you want to get the soil covered with a plant. But for the home gardener, the recommendation I would give is that you want to interplant. So within your veggie garden, maybe you want to have some perennial herbs growing in there, some thyme, some parsley if you can get it to overwinter, some sage, these things that will stay in the ground year round. So you don't have just this one raised bed that sits empty for the shoulder seasons, for the winter seasons. You always want roots in there because, like I said, the soil food web, the bacteria and the fungus, they colonize around the roots. So if you're constantly ripping the plants out of the ground at the end of the season, they're going to go because they don't have anywhere to live. Unless you give them organic matter, then they can hide in there and feed off of it. But it's good to have mixed into your veggie garden some perennial edibles. So it could be medicinal plants, lemon balm, mint, thyme, sage, all these things that will last, but so you're constantly feeding that soil. So I like to interplant perennials with my annuals. Yeah, and like I said earlier, another great one is wood chips, but that's more for perennial beds. I wouldn't recommend it for annual beds, but if it's all you have, use it. and particularly if it's decomposed. So you don't want to use fresh wood chips, but once they've broken down, then they can be quite a good resource.
So for your raised bed, does it make any sense just to cut back the veggies and leave the roots, or would you just sense?
No, so I am a big proponent of leaving roots in the ground because decaying roots will provide food for the microorganisms. They'll eat them through the winter. It will also provide little tunnels. So a lot of what creates soil structure is little tunnels within the soil. So as those roots die off, where the root was previously, there'll be this little tunnel for air and water to move through, and also create a good environment for the soil microbes to live in and move through the soil. So I usually cut off at the base. Sometimes you'll have things regrow in the spring, cut it off again in the spring, and that should usually kill it. Yeah, so try and keep the roots in the ground if you can. I know it's not always realistic all of the time, especially if you want to put a new plant in there. But if you do it in the fall and then plant in the spring, it should be all decomposed by then. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was seed saving. Yeah, any of you guys experience with saving your own seeds? Yeah, that's something new that I've been getting into the last couple years, but I think it's really important, and it kind of showed me how important it is with COVID when you couldn't really get seeds. I was like, whoa, okay. I mean, we better get on it saving seeds because, yeah, it's pretty frightening when you can't access seeds when you want them. And the fact is that plants produce seeds for their future generation. They're asking you to save them, really, is how I feel. And so, yeah, you're basically just collecting them before the natural progression of what the plant wants to do. So I wanted to talk a little bit about seed saving and benefits of seed saving. So the first benefit is that you know that it's an organic seed, and you know that it's come from a healthy plant and it's adapted to your growing conditions. So you can buy seeds from Johnny's Seeds down in Maine, but you know, that growing condition isn't going to be the same growing condition as Whistler. So when you save seeds, although maybe your original seed came from Johnny's, over the season, if you're taking from the most successful plant, it's going to be more adapted to this environment that it's been learning to grow in for the whole year. So that's one of the great reasons that you can actually tailor the seeds to be really productive, and you can tailor the seeds that the crop that you like the most. So if you really like the color of a certain tomato or a certain plant, or you really like the taste, you can select for those things. So it becomes like a personal experience. And then another reason is that fresh seed has the highest germination rate. So if you're saving seeds this season, you want to plant them right away. And there's a lot of people saving seeds in seed banks, but that's not really the way to do it. To have good viable seeds, you want them in the ground. So if you save the seeds this year, you want to plant them next year. Although they will be viable depending on the seed. Each seed is a little bit different. But yeah, having a healthy seed bank is having a lot of plants in the ground, in my opinion. Yeah, so like I said, safeguarding food security. So just making sure that you have access to food. Seeds are really, really important for that. And protecting genetic diversity and making crops more adaptable to climate change. So with the ever increasing genetically modified seeds that we have in the world, and crops becoming more genetically modified, and we're losing this diversity of different kinds of seeds. So when you're seed saving, you're expanding this bank of seeds in the world, and making them more adaptable for the years to come. So if you have a seed from 2000, it's adapted to the climate that was in 2000, and if that's changing 20 years later, your seed might not be able to change with the times. So saving seeds every year is a really, really good practice. Yeah, so there's two different kinds of seeds. You have self-pollinating seeds and cross-pollinating seeds. So self-pollinating seeds means that they'll just pollinate on their own, obviously. So these are just the different examples of self-pollinating seeds: lettuce, bush beans, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, squash, and cucumbers. So they're going to produce seed, and they have what is referred to as a perfect flower. So they have both male and female parts within the flower, and so they can pollinate on their own and create seed that way. So all you have to do is plant a lettuce and let it go to seed. So that means letting it flower and then letting the flowers go to seed, and you want to select for the best producing lettuce. And then at the end of the season, saving the seeds off of that plant. Same with beans and peas, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, squash, and cucumbers. Whereas cross-pollinating seeds, they usually need to be isolated. So if you have multiple species of brassicas, and you have birds and insects coming to pollinate them, they're going to mix their pollen with the pollen from the plant that they just came from, and that's going to make for genetic impurities. So if you did want to save seeds from things like leeks, onions, beets, chard, spinach, you just want to plant one variety. Or you want to have them really farly spaced, but with a home garden, you don't really have that option. So if you are wanting to save seeds from those, you're just going to stick to one variety so that you don't have mix up. But if your neighbor is planting a different variety, then you might get genetic impurities in your seeds. So some common seed saving problems, like I mentioned, genetic impurities, harvesting seeds before maturation. So your flower is going to go to seed, and then you want to wait until it's turned really light brown and dried out. So another thing to test is, so you're looking for a light brown color on your seed, and then you want to make sure it's really hard. So if you take your fingernail and you pinch the seed, and if you can pinch it, then it's not ready. Whereas if it stays hard and strong and keeps its integrity, that means it's ready. Not drying seeds thoroughly before storage. So if you are saving seeds, like here I have a bag of carrot seeds, so I snip the carrots off. Carrots are biannual, so if you plant a carrot this year, you're going to get a carrot, and if you leave it in the ground over winter, the next season you're going to get a flowering stalk from that carrot. And you let the flowering stalk live out its days. The birds and the bees love it. They're great pollinators, so I always leave carrots in the ground. And then the next year you have this beautiful, it looks like Queen Anne's lace. It smells really great, and big white umbilicores. And then as soon as they're dried out, and this season has been a really good season for seed saving because we haven't had any rain. There's lots of issues with not having rain, but one of the good things is that it's been really easy to save seeds. So you want to let them dry out. So I cut the stalk of the carrot seed and I put them in a paper bag. And then all the carrot seeds are gonna just fall into the paper bag. And then this spring I will have tons of carrot seeds. I wanted to get out, but I'm worried that carrot seeds will fly. But maybe we can pass it around and you can look. So all the carrot seeds from the flowers have fallen into the bag. And then you want to make sure they're dried out quite thoroughly before putting them in storage. So these are some flower seeds that I've been saving. So before putting them in a yogurt container or an airtight container, you want to maybe leave them in a paper bag or put them out on a plate somewhere to dry before putting them away. So then you don't have any mold or moisture issues. And then labeling them. Labeling date, year, as much information as you can about them will be helpful for the next season. So I saved a bunch of calendula seeds this year. If anybody wants to take some home and grow them in their garden next year, you're welcome to. Calendula are a great beneficial flower and companion plant in your veggie garden. They're good to plant around asparagus and tomatoes and just anything because they attract pollinators. It's edible and medicinal, so we use it a lot in desserts. We have a restaurant on site, and the kitchen loves to put the petals on desserts, cakes, cocktails, all that kind of stuff. And then they're also medicinal, so they're great for lotions. This year I put calendula petals in oil, and then you let it sit for a few weeks, and you take it out with a cheesecloth, and it has a lot of medicinal properties for your skin. They can be stored up to 10 years, and yeah, make sure they're dried out before saving them. So if anybody wants some calendula seeds to plant next year, yeah, they're grown from this season. The last thing I wanted to talk about was planting garlic. I realize the time, so I'm kind of moving a little bit quicker, but this is the time to plant garlic. Do you guys plant garlic? Garlic is one of my easiest things to plant. It's just like a no-brainer. Everyone should have garlic in their garden. And October is the month for planting garlic. Since you guys have all planted garlic, you have seed, hopefully, but if you don't have your own seed or a farmer or a neighbor to get it from, I recommend going with reputable growers. You don't want to just buy garlic from the grocery store because it's often sprayed with sprout preventing chemicals. The bigger the clove you're going to get, the bigger the bulb. So this is the garlic seed that we grew this year. So this is pretty good seed size. And then we cure it for a few weeks, for a few months. We pull it out in July, and then you cure it until October. So you want to hang it in bundles. And then once it's ready, you're just going to separate it, clean off the cloves. Yeah, I have some more step-by-step for people that are interested in knowing more, but sounds like you guys all grow garlic by now. So putting it in a really manure or compost rich area, they do really well with a lot of organic matter. Make sure your plot is moist before planting. That's really important this season because if you're planting your garlic in the next couple weeks and there hasn't been any rain, it's not going to be very happy. So you want to make sure the garden is moist before you plant. I'm waiting to plant garlic because it's still so warm and it might cause it to sprout before the season, and that's not going to be good. So you want to do it basically right before the frost hits, and that's true with all bulbs. You don't want them to be you don't want to encourage them to start sprouting now. You want them to send all that energy into their root zones and come up in the spring. So you want to get it in right before while the soil's still easy to work, but right before the frost hits. So you got to time it right. And mulching is really important with the cloves because you want them to stay underground and in cold temperatures but not freeze. So putting a layer of mulch, straw, wood chips, heavy compost, leaves, and yeah, a few other things to consider for this time of year is mapping your garden. So if you want to make some changes next year or plan what things are going to look like for next year, it's great to just spend a lot of time in the garden. Maybe draw like a rough picture. Maybe if you're digital, take some photos or draw something up on one of the computer softwares. This is a drone shot of the farm I work at. I'm sure you guys won't need anything like that, but just doing a rough picture. I like to note where the sun hits at certain times of the day, so you know exactly which corner of your garden and how many hours of light it gets all through the year. That's really pertinent information to recognize, because then when you're crop planting over the winter, you can know, okay, this section of my garden gets 7 hours of light. What are the best crops that can go there? So having all of this data going into the winter is going to make planning for the spring that much easier. And then it just means that you're spending time in your garden observing, which is the best thing that you can do. Just to learn to watch how things interact, to see where the sun hits, to see where, like this year, I've been really aware of the interactions between the sun and the buildings. So that's going to be the hottest spot in your garden. When you have the buildings absorbing all of that heat, that's where you want to plant all of your heat-loving crops, your basil, your tomatoes if you can grow them, your squashes, your cucumbers. So just mapping it out, looking, observing, and tracking the sun, tracking the soil, where, when the rains come, where floods and where drains, because that will also certain crops like more well-draining soil or wetter soil. So you can get all that information now. Yeah, I think that's everything I have for you guys this evening. If you have any questions.
Contorted carrots, maybe.
So I was probably your soil. I didn't know what kind of soil you have, and said that you're working in the carrots like very loose soil.
Yeah, but that's
Soil
what you get the
draining.
compaction.
There's probably too much compaction, and you didn't transplant it, you direct seeded it.
No, it was transplanted.
That's carrots, always direct seed carrots.
Oh, okay.
Always direct seed carrots. Always direct seed vegetables.
Except if you're not around mid-June.
Yeah, I would say your carrots, it was probably the transplant.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my experience, always direct seed carrots, spinach, and beets. That's, I've tried it both ways, and direct seed.
You mentioned earlier that radishes would go into the soil in the fall. Is that also true in wisdom?
Radishes?
Yeah.
So
Good one
you
of the
can
spots.
put them in the soil, you're not gonna get a harvest out of them, but they're gonna be amazing cover crops is how I would use them. So if you have compacted soil, and where I'm working, we have a lot of clay content, and radishes are really good where they're fall, especially if you have like icon radishes, but they're gonna break up that soil, and then they have their greens, and that's gonna protect the soil.
And then what time of the year should you, or in September, or is it now too late to do it?
August is a great time. September is a little bit late, but it depends. Like this year, you could have done it in September because we had such a warm fall. Another great thing about radishes is as the bulb is decomposing, that's going to add nutrients to your soil. It's also going to be a great place for bugs and organisms to live in through the winter. So they'll burrow and they'll basically rot from the inside out. And then come spring, they'll be decomposed, but all those organisms will be moving around in your soil. And the leaves will have decomposed and release nitrogen in, and it will help the soil really well. So radishes are a great cover crop for compacted soil.
We prepared our soil for winter. So come spring, is that soil ready to plant in, or are we gonna?
Yeah, it should be. Sometimes I like to, if I'm doing transplants in the springtime, I like to give a little bit of compost at the bottom of each transplant just to give it an extra boost. But with direct seeding, just go for it as long as if you're just mulching and not applying compost, it might be a good idea to do compost in the spring, or at least on the surface of the soil if you're direct seeding, or at the base of each transplant. But if you are composting in the fall, then it should be not a problem.
We haven't mentioned manure.
Yeah, so manure, I
I work a lot with manure. Manure is good if it's aged. You're gonna get a crop of barley come up potentially, because it has moved through the rumen's stomach, but it's not killed the seed or made it. Yeah, it's still viable seed even though it's moved through the rumen, and it's actually going to be really viable seed because it has tons of bacteria and a lot of fertilizer, so it's actually going to do really, really well. Aged manure is good. Chicken manure is the best manure you can find. It's the highest in nitrogen, and that's because the chicken eats the seed of the grass, whereas all the other rumens eat the grass, so they have the highest nitrogen content in their manure. If you can get decomposed chicken manure, it's great. The one thing is that if you're getting manure from inorganic animals that are eating grains that have been sprayed, they're gonna have those chemicals in their manure, and then those are gonna be spread throughout your garden, and those are gonna end up killing organisms. It could do more harm than good. So if you're gonna source manure, make sure it's organic, make sure it's well aged. And another concern is sometimes that manure can carry pathogens if the animals that the manure is coming from is not healthy. So if I'm using manure, I like to compost it first. And I like to compost it through a composting called Vermicomposting, which gets up to really high temperatures. So it's going to get up to 65 degrees Celsius, and that's going to kill weed seeds, and it's going to kill any animal pathogens, and then it's safe to use. It's a great thing to use, but those are the two concerns with manure, is that animal pathogens and weed seeds.
So what about mushroom manure then?
Yeah, mushroom manure is good. I've heard at Squamish Hand on the little farm plot that they have there, she bought mushroom manure and it totally wiped out all her legumes. And they think maybe the mushrooms were sprayed with a herbicide, which doesn't really make any sense. But mushroom manure is good. It's usually quite affordable and it has a lot of organic matter in it. It might not have a ton of biology because it's one single food group. So when you're adding compost or manure, you want multiple sources. That's why manure is so good, because the grass moves through the rumen's stomach, and the stomach of these cows, horses, sheep, goats have tons of bacteria that are now coming out in their poop, whereas with mushroom manure, I don't know how true that is. But again, it's a great source of organic matter.
So say you have perfect manure, how many inches do you put on the surface of the soil?
2 inches,
And just leave it?
just leave it, yeah.
Now, if you have perennial leaves that aren't waxy, can you use them?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Sometimes with perennials, it's hard to get the leaves without the stalks.
Yeah.
And sometimes the stalks are very weak and they take a long time to break down. And sometimes as they're breaking down, they're actually stealing nitrogen from your soil. It comes back to a homeostasis eventually. This is the same with adding wood chips onto your garden. Fresh wood chips are actually going to harm your soil initially, and then as they break down, they'll re-add it back to your soil. So it usually takes a couple of years. So it might be the same with woody perennials, but if you can separate the leaves and just use those, then it can be good.
I have a lot of small pots. I have like a large area, but what are my small pots? Am I better off, like, the end of last year, I threw all the small pots into a big bucket, because I figured that would even out whatever had been depleted, but then that disturbs the roots. Am I better off?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of no-till gardening, so that would mean not turning the soil, not disrupting the soil. So if you have it in pots, yeah, I would leave it if you want, because you're basically, within the pot, you're creating an ecosystem. And as soon as you mix it all together, you're going to disrupt that ecosystem. And yeah, it's just going to take a while for that life to rebuild itself. So it's a good thing if you're having like heavy compaction in your pots and you want to fluff up those not good if you want longevity of that soil into the future. If you're always disturbing it, it's never going to have that chance to get the right balance of organisms going on and be able to come to a homeostasis kind of place. But covering the soil, adding compost each year, kind of layering. There's a style of gardening called Lasagna Gardening, where you basically make a bed with lots of layers of different types of organic matter. So you could do that in your pots. So you could start the layer with like wood chips or little sticks, and then add aged manure, and then like kind of layer, and with each season layer more on top of the pots.
Emily, I'm wondering, should we do our skill testing questions now?
Yeah.
Just in case anybody has to go.
Yeah.
I certainly don't mind sticking around for more questions, but I know everybody's time is valuable. Do you know what your questions are going to be?
I know what one of them is going to be, so let's start
Well,
with
I'll do
that one.
my rules of play first. You must raise your hand if you know the answer, and do not yell out the answer until I call on you with your raised hand. Okay, question one, go ahead. I'm watching carefully.
Name 5 different mulch options that were presented today.
Okay, this hand, grass clippings, straw, manure, leaves, and wood. And sorry.
10, 9.
Ring, 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 ring. Wow, that was a hard question. Would you like a mug or? Wonderful, there you go. Okay, have you come up with your second question?
Okay.
It could be a softball after that one.
That was my softball one.
Oh, wonderful. Could be a definition.
In what is the name 2 microorganisms?
Go for it.
Nematodes and mycorrhizal fungus.
Woo! We got it.
Wow. Great. Amazing. And I will also just say, like what Emily did tonight, you did say you could talk for 2 hours on vermicomposting. We can culture to that if you want. You all have my email here, so let me know how you liked tonight's talk, and let me know if you want more gardening stuff. I guess technically we can talk about gardening during the winter, even though we're not doing it.
Yeah.
So anyways, that's my little PSA. If you do have any more questions for Emily, we have time for a couple more. So
This might be a dumb question, but
No such
I
thing.
mulched in the spring with some regular compost from the bag in the washing place. And I noticed in the fall now, I have different kinds of mushrooms coming up. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Do I rip them out? Do I just leave them? Do I grind them up and leave them lying out there? And why? Because I have never had that before.
So it probably came from mushroom compost. So spores are able to live in high temperatures. So if it's decomposed, it might be mushroom compost, it might just be spores in the air, but they've basically found a place to land that is rich in organic matter where they can grow. And it's a really good thing for your garden. It means that there's lots of interactions going on in there and having mycorrhizal fungi. So mycorrhizal fungi is the fungus that lives underground, and then the mushrooms that you see popping up, those are the fruiting bodies. So it's the apple of the apple tree. So you can't even see the tree, you just see the fruit. So there's tons going on underneath the surface, and it's really beneficial. Particularly in perennial gardens, it's not as beneficial in annual gardens, but it's still beneficial for the soil.
It wasn't my veggie.
No, it's
So
great.
just leave them standing there?
You can just leave them standing. If you don't like the look of them, you can throw them, you know, behind the bush, but it's great that they're there. And even if you do kill the fruiting body, the organism underground is still alive. So you can only disrupt it if you dig up the soil, if you disturb the soil, you're gonna slice. Mycorrhizal fungi is like you know, your brain neurons. It's this web of tunnels. And you can't really destroy it unless you go in and dig it up. So it's fine if you want to discard the mushrooms that you're finding in your garden, but it's a really good sign.
So should you, like, I've got mushrooms in my lawn, should I throw them into my veggie garden?
Yeah.
That'd be good, like the way.
Veggies, like I said, okay, so vegetables really like bacteria colonies around their roots because bacteria basically live and die. They have like a 20-minute lifespan. So they basically are born, they eat, they procreate, and they die. And with that cycle, it's constantly happening. And annuals like that because annuals go in the soil and they get taken out of the soil. Whereas a fungus can live for so long, like longer than us. So annual plants like bacteria and more perennial long-lasting plants like the fungus because they will support it for the longevity of its life. Fungus won't even associate with annual plants because they're going to die within the year. So there's no point in forming this relationship because it's not going to be long-lasting.
So no, then. Right.
Yes, it might not survive. So you can try. It's good for soil structure. It's good for nutrient cycling, but it's not necessarily going to be a great benefit directly to your plants. But this is why I like to have perennial plants in my veggie garden because they will form those associations. So it would be good to throw them in there if you have, say, thyme growing, if you have sage growing, if you have mint, parsley. They're going to form those association with the fungus, whereas your carrots, your beets, they're not even going to bother.
Are people allowed to come out to the lodge or is it just kind of a private?
So we are starting to offer more tours and groups, and we want to offer that to the community.
Don't just show up.
Don't just show up unless you text me first. But yeah, they want to keep it kind of private in case, because when people rent it or book it, they book the whole thing. So if people are just showing up, it creates not, people feel like they spend the money to have the whole place to themselves, so we can't just have people coming in randomly. But if you wanted to book a tour, we would be happy to do that.
Can you do a workshop for us? We'll be there.
Yeah, that's the plan. What would you like the workshop in?
I just want to see you guys. I've read so much about it. You can teach us anything.
It's really just a sneak peek at the center, I think.
I mean, Claire and the other girl,
Harriet.
yeah, they all had their own topics, so all three of you can have your own little topics. Yeah.
Well, that's the plan. We want to basically become a hub for people that want to learn more information to come and learn and do hands-on. And what's really nice is that we have all this lodging. So if we want, people can come and stay for a night, and maybe on the first day we can give a talk, on the second day we can do a hands-on project. You know, it offers. So basically we want to host things like this there all the time on all the different topics. So definitely keep your eyes out for different upcoming workshops, talks, conferences.
I just had a question about leaving the stuff in the ground. We're encouraged to take everything up and actually leave it dead when we're gardening.
Yeah.
With all our leaves around. But I haven't taken everything out yet. So should I just cut the beans off? Like,
Absolutely.
and then leave the little plant, and I still have some kale, I can cut that off. Just leave the roots where they are.
Definitely leave the roots where they are. I'm even a big proponent of leaving organic material,
Yeah.
but I understand a lot of people don't like the way it looks.
Yeah.
It's not very aesthetically pleasing, especially come springtime and all the snow melts and there's all this dead decaying plant matter, but that's how nature does it, you know? You know, you don't look into a forest and you think this looks like a mess. But it's really important to keep the roots of legumes in the ground. So beans, peas, these things, they're what are called nitrogen fixers.
Yeah.
And so they take, if you've ever pulled out a bean plant, you'll see that on the root hairs, they've got these little nodules on them. You can look at them the next time you have a healthy bean growing, or when you pull it out, you'll see these little nodules living on their root zones, and that's a colonization of bacteria called rhizobia, and it is really, really good at taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and bringing it into the soil. So having those little colonies of bacteria are going to be really, really amazing for your garden. So you never pull out the bean plants and look at the nodule because it's cool to see. But try and always leave the roots of legumes around and the foliage of legumes. It's really, really good.
So what about planting the next season in the same spot? Like I usually put the beans, against the trellis.
Yeah. Some people are really strong advocates of crop rotation, and I understand why. But I think if you're amending the soil well with compost each year, it's not a problem because there will be enough organic matter to provide all of the nutrients that that plant needs year after year. But if you ever have issues with disease, rot, those types of things, then you definitely want to move it. But for the most part, if you're amending your soil well, you should never have nutrient deficiencies in the soil.
But there'd still be little stumps of plants down.
They should rot throughout the winter. They should, and if they don't, you can usually work around them. In my experience, it's harder with brassicas because they have this big stalk.
Yeah.
But the smaller plants will usually die off by the winter.
Well, I'm going to do it, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm really sad. I pulled out fava beans. I will never grow them again. It's too small of a place.
Yeah.
But so all beans are nitrogen.
All legumes.
Oh,
Yeah.
because I had red fava beans really in soil.
Yeah.
And it was so hot this summer, I cut the plants off. I had all these new little plantlets and more beans.
Yeah.
And I've now pulled all of these out.
Yeah, yeah. So usually, if you're cutting something off in the summertime, it will probably keep growing back.
Yeah.
But if you do a second cutting, it will probably kill it. And if you cut it back closer to the winter, it probably won't come back the next season. But if it does survive through the winter, cut it again come spring, and that should kill it for sure.
Without having to pull it out.
Without having to pull it out. It is painful because sometimes you have to keep coming back to the same plant and they just won't die, but pulling out the roots is probably the worst thing you can do, so you try to avoid it at all.
All right. I'm going to
News to me.
I know.
With,
All right, thank you.
sunflowers.
Cut them off at the base is usually how I do it.
Yeah, and then just leave it.
Yeah.
Great.
Right at the base, yeah, and so usually if you cut it at the base and it wants to come back, cut it at the base and again, and then it's done. Yeah. Try and get as close, because you want to cut off any plant material because it will continue photosynthesizing, right? So you want to make sure you get all of the chlorophyll, basically the green part, out, because then it doesn't have, it can't. Plants make their own food. They're one of the only, like on the soil food web sheet, they're the first trophic level. So they're the only organism, like one of the only organisms on the world that produce their own food. So if you cut off its ability to produce its own food, which is getting from sunlight.
Right.
And so if you're having the issue where it's coming back, cut it off at the base, you cover it with mulch or compost, and don't give it any access to sunlight, and then it will die for sure.
So why wouldn't you just, if it comes back in the spring, why wouldn't you just leave it and then that's one less plant that you have to see?
Usually, it doesn't taste that good.
Oh, I know the kale, I've kept it going for years and it just keeps coming back, but it doesn't taste good.
Yeah, some. Ooh, it gets bitter and it goes to seed really quickly. That's what I've noticed. Yeah.
You were talking about mulching a lawn. How much mulch do you, like, if you wanted to leave leaves on a lawn, how much?
So if I were to leave leaves on a lawn, I would run over it with a lawnmower.
Like, we're at the point when the leaves start to come down, because we're in cottonwood forests.
Yeah.
We rake every weekend, all weekend. It's unbelievable.
Yes, you have so many leaves.
So that's so, like, we would have this much.
Yeah, okay, so you wanna, it will suffocate the grass and steal the nitrogen. So you wouldn't wanna leave more than a few centimeters. Yeah, like a covering, and you want the leaves to be kind of broken down so that light can still get in, air can still get in, because if you're leaving a mat of leaves, you can imagine it's just gonna suffocate the grass underneath. So it's really good to help fertilize, but it might suffocate and will reduce the light it has access to. So, yeah.
I having had what I think the Vermicomposting gardener is the Perennial rot type virus in my beans and my peas 2 years in a row. What's the best thing to do with that soil? I think I'm just not going to grow them for a couple of years. I think it's living in the thimbleberry patches around Compaction.
I would grow a different variety in that soil, replace the soil. Do you have a way to decompose that soil? Like compost it?
Or I mean, I can throw it. You have like a slag heap that I just throw things into today.
Yeah, I have one of those too. So I would try planting other varieties and see if they can survive. Would avoid planting any legumes in there for at least a year, ideally 2. And if it were me, I would decompose the soil at temperatures that will kill anything.
I think it'll just come back. Like I also read about the thimbleberries, which has all the little critters that I love.
Yeah.
And then the big blue aphids in, so it always goes from one end of the deck to the other. So I've started to like hide my tomatoes like around the corner, so they don't get infected so quickly.
Yeah.
With spinach, do you feel like a good thing to put in that soil, or does it really matter what you put in?
I think just experiment. You know, I've never had experience with what you're talking about, so I can't give you, the best information, but it's just trial and error. Just try different things out, see if it works. Trial and error. That's what it is.
$1 million question. What do we do with fossil in vegetables?
Just learn to love it. It's medicinal. It's medicinal. It's really good for hair, skin, and nails. Some people say it's poison. No, it's really good if you dry it and you put it in your smoothie or you make tea from it.
So the library holds no liability if you try that.
Just cut them over to the same thing.
You don't want them in bed. You don't want them in bed. Try and keep them at bay, but
Oh, what do you do?
you pull them out.